Good morning from the Concord Coalition. I'm Tori Gorman, Policy Director for the organization, and I'm joined this morning by our Executive Director, Bob Bixby. Bob, how are you today?
Pretty good, Tori. How are you?
I'm fine. Today we're flipping the script. Bob has graciously given the microphone over to me, and I'm very excited. So let's jump right in. Much of the conversation over the last few weeks has focused on the federal government's response to the coronavirus pandemic and the impact of those policies on the federal budget. Today, however, we'd like to cast a tentative eye to the future and consider the post-pandemic economy. But before we do that, let's take a moment and set the stage. So, since the outbreak began, non-essential businesses across the nation have been temporarily shuttered. As of this morning, about 33 million people have filed for unemployment. The economy contracted almost 5% in the first quarter of this year and will likely drop at an unprecedented amount in the second quarter. Federal lawmakers have passed 4 pieces of legislation containing emergency funding to help fight this virus and mitigate the economic effects. And the sum total of that fiscal response so far has been at least $2.5 trillion. It's probably more, and then we'll probably add more. And the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office expects the federal deficit this year to reach $4 trillion, a 4-fold increase from just a few months ago. So, Bob, with that in mind, with deficits exploding and the number of deaths rising attributed to the coronavirus, what should lawmakers be prioritizing right now, and why?
Well, just a point of interest here. When the Concord Coalition started, we were warning about a $4 trillion national debt. Not the $4 trillion deficit.
How far we've come.
1 year, yeah, I know. Interesting benchmarks. Look, all that having been said, these are staggering economic and budgetary numbers. But the first thing that Congress needs to do, number one priority, is fight the virus. This is not like a traditional recession where you have some fundamental imbalance in the economy. I mean, obviously there's an imbalance in the economy, but it's a self-induced sort of a thing, which is directed at fighting the spread of the virus. So no economic plan is going to work. You can call it stimulus or rescue or whatever it is. Nothing's going to work until people feel confident enough to go out of their homes again, to go back to work and get back on public transportation and airlines and that sort of thing. So if people are afraid of not getting a paycheck, whether they're going to get sick if they go to the grocery store, I mean, we can't really think about any sort of economic recovery until the virus is brought under control. So that still has to be job number one.
Right. So Concord Coalition recently published an essay on how the old normal won't be good enough in a post-pandemic economy. Bob, you were the author of that essay. What did you mean by that?
Well, we're getting a lot of talk about getting back to normal. It's a really important thing to get back to normal. And I thought it was important to just lay out a marker there that the normal that we were in, say going back to February or January, was unsustainable. I mean, economic growth was on a low projected path. The budget was on an unsustainable path. And so obviously it would be nice to do a lot better than we're doing now. But if we're going to go through the pain of sort of reforming the economy and having a new debate about a new normal after this pandemic, we should be thinking about the reasons why the old normal was unsustainable and treat those problems as well.
So back in January, before the pandemic hit the U.S. in full force, CBO was predicting an average annual economic growth of around 2% per year over the next decade, and trillion-dollar deficits each year as far as the eye can see. So it sounds like what you're saying to me is that that old normal, it just shouldn't be good enough. Lawmakers should aim higher. When we talk about a post-pandemic economy, they need to do better and think beyond, just 2% growth and $1 trillion deficits. They need to do much better than that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And the time for that discussion isn't right now.
Right.
As we were just saying, the first thing you need to do is get the virus under control. But sometime soon, there will be, it might be the fall, it might be early next year. I don't know. It's just important to remember that 2% economic growth that people were talking about, that's subpar. I mean, we used to be able to count on 2.5 to 3% or even higher than that,
Right.
for annual economic growth, and budget deficits were, not routinely going to 5% of GDP. They were more like between 2 and 3% of GDP. So a solid economic recovery is not going to take place if we go back to just the old normal, because that wasn't good enough then. So the standard needs to be set higher.
Exactly. So I'm curious, what should Congress be doing now or not doing to ensure that we don't revert to that old normal? So is there sort of like a Bob Bixby's list of do's and don'ts for Congress right now?
Yeah, wear a mask. I mean, that's the important thing first. But I think that it might be easier to talk about don'ts, a couple of don'ts.
Sure.
One is you don't need to make the long-term structural deficit worse in order to address the short-term problem, either providing funds to backstop the economy or fighting the virus. So whatever we do, we have this, again, the old normal underlying structural deficit where spending promises were growing faster than projected revenues. So no permanent changes in spending or tax laws to fight the pandemic. Do it on a timely, targeted, and temporary basis, as we always say. It can be as aggressive as it needs to be, but it doesn't need to be changes in permanent policy in order to be effective.
Right.
Second don't would be, don't retreat into partisan talking points and partisan wish lists and that sort of thing, because I mean, so far there's been overwhelming bipartisan support to the measures that Congress has passed. That clearly has frayed, and the next bill probably is going to have a major, partisan talking points into it. But if if everybody retreats into their, trench warfare on this stuff, then the important work that they need to do combating the virus won't get done. So I'd say don't retreat into the partisan agendas, or put them on the table if you want to, but rise above to do negotiations. On the do side, again, I think that it's really concentrate on the virus. I really think that a nationwide testing regime needs to get in place before the economy is going to rebound, and that has to come from somewhere. And maybe Congress could write and fund and agree on some sort of national strategy for testing and developing a vaccine. And so there's a little bit of a scattershot approach feel to things right now.
Right.
And it just sort of needs to come together in a strategy. So I think that that's a good economic strategy, is to have a testing strategy. So that would be something I'd throw in as a wild card.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So I'm curious, if you were testifying before Congress today, what advice would you give to lawmakers who are looking at the sort of long-term post-pandemic economy and searching for policies that essentially, punch above their weight? Policies that have significant growth potential, but that don't increase the deficit. So what policy areas do you think Congress should be looking at? What are sort of the, proverbial sweet spots, so to speak?
Well, we looked at what we call a fiscally responsible economic growth agenda project that we worked on last year. And when the time comes to get back to thinking about the longer term economy, I'd go back to some of those issues of, one of them is healthcare reform.
Sure.
And we're talking a lot about healthcare now, but the healthcare reform for the longer term needs to be a way of making healthcare delivery more efficient and effective, and not basing it so much on quantity of services, but of quality of care. A lot of ideas in that area. I think that the progress was being made before this. So we need to get back to that, because healthcare is such a huge part of the federal budget and the economy, nearly 20% of the economy. So getting a better growth rate with better results on healthcare is probably the most important thing. But the other thing is making Social Security solvent on a sustainable basis. It isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Program is running big deficits on a cash basis, and as the trust funds will run out within about 15 years. So it's hard for me to see people feeling good about the economy if you've got folks worried not just about their paychecks in the workforce, but their retirement money from Social Security, because there'd have to be about a 20% benefit cut if we don't do something within about 15 years.
Right.
So we got to address that. Then there's a bunch of workforce issues that we needed to address. I mean, I think that, we've got a much older population. We need to worry about a much slower workforce growth. So are there some wise immigration policies that could help there? Worker training is going to be really important, because it's not just, I think we could have done a better job before the pandemic hit, but
Sure.
we're really going to have to worry about people shifting careers and developing new skills and having lifelong learning. And that's really come to the fore in the pandemic. So I think Congress needs to take a real close look at that. And also investments. I mean, the federal government just doesn't do a very good job of investing. And so whether it's for productivity in the workforce, or for a stronger healthcare system, or for whatever, the federal government needs to step up on doing some investments that will really help jumpstart a sustainable economic growth path. So those are a few things.
Yeah, very interesting. So I was actually reading recently an article talking about sort of worker retraining and worker productivity. And some of the thoughts, a lot of the policies recently have been focused on training workers where they live, but that's not necessarily where the jobs are. So there's sort of a new interest in perhaps moving workers from where they are now to where the jobs are. So I think there's definitely a lot of interesting think work going on in the area of job retraining and creating new jobs. So yeah, very interesting points. It'll be interesting to see what Congress does there. So Bob, thank you so much for your insights and your perspectives today. That's all we have. If you like what you've heard, please follow the Concord Coalition and our policy experts on Twitter and Facebook. We also invite you to subscribe to our podcast, Facing the Future, which you can find on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find additional information on our website. We have all kinds of great information on budget, fiscal policy, graphs, charts, etc. on our website at www.concordcoalition.org. Bob, thanks so much for your time today.
Great. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Bye.
Bye.